The Mafia Boss flew with his fiancée to vacation until he saw his ex in the next seat with a child. Welcome back to Heartwoven Tales. I'm Selena, and I hope you're doing wonderfully today. Before we begin, I want to ask, where are you listening to me from? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to know. May your day be filled with peace, love, and protection, and may every challenge you face turn into strength and blessing. Today, I've brought you a story that comes straight from the heart, a tale of love, choices, and secrets that survived time, distance, and even betrayal. I created this story because I wanted to explore what happens when the past meets the present, when love isn't just felt, but earned through patience, courage, and truth. Suspense, emotion, and deep connections await you. Moments that will make your heart race, your mind question, and your soul feel every twist. So I promise you, stay with me till the very end. Don't skip, because every second matters, every revelation counts. And if you love stories that touch your heart and keep you on the edge of your seat, please subscribe to Heartwoven Tales. Now let's dive into the story and see how love survives everything. Markaram adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit as he stepped into the private terminal. The familiar hum of engines and distant voices blending into a background he had long learned to ignore. Every step echoed in the polished hall, yet his mind was already halfway to Spain, imagining the narrow streets of Barcelona bathed in sunlight, the scent of fresh pastries drifting from corner cafes, the quiet rhythm of life that he rarely allowed himself to experience. It was supposed to be a simple trip, a vacation carefully planned with Maddie, his fiancée, the kind of woman who understood that his life was never ordinary, who never demanded control he wasn't ready to give. He had boarded countless planes in his lifetime, flights that carried him over continents and into power, money, and influence. But this time felt different. The cabin smelled faintly of leather and antiseptic, a sterile perfume he had come to associate with transience, with journeys that always ended somewhere unfamiliar. He walked down the aisle, his polished shoes silent against the plush carpeting, eyes scanning the passengers with an instinct born of decades in positions where a single glance could warn of betrayal or opportunity. Then, as he settled into his seat and fastened his belt, he noticed her. Not immediately. The years had blurred the edges of memory, softened them like a photograph left in the sun too long. But a small, familiar tension stirred in his chest, a recognition that went beyond sight. She sat with a child in her lap, her posture calm, precise and contained, her hair brushing gently against her shoulders, as if she had no idea of the storm she was about to unleash in the heart of a man who thought he had mastered every part of himself. He didn't recognize her face at first. He recognized the weight, the atmosphere she carried effortlessly, the subtle way the light caught her profile, highlighting angles that memory could not lie about. Lara. The name had been whispered in silence, carried in the hollow of his chest where no one else had entered. She had once been the axis around which his world turned, the only presence he hadn't been able to command, the only vulnerability he had never accepted. And now, after years of control, after decisions made in blood and fire, she appeared quietly in the seat beside him, with a child whose small eyes looked at him like he had always existed in some forgotten corner of their life. The child was still, observing, aware in a way that unsettled Markaram. Children were supposed to be innocent, naive, unable to perceive the intricate web of human emotions adults wove. Yet this child's gaze held depth, a subtle understanding that spoke of quiet intelligence and instincts that mirrored his own. Instincts he had trained and honed through years of life that never forgave mistakes. Markaram's fingers itched against the armrest, a reflex born of tension he could not yet name, and he found himself studying them without conscious permission. The engines roared beneath the fuselage, vibrating through the cabin, shaking him back into the present. He was a man who had survived everything, a man who had stared down death and betrayal alike, without flinching. And yet, in that moment, he felt a tremor inside himself that was entirely unfamiliar, a disturbance that no power, no wealth, no influence could quiet. He wanted to look away, to retreat into the familiar armor of his control, but his body refused. His eyes, drawn as if by magnetism, lingered on her, noting the subtle curve of her jaw, the way her fingers rested on the child's shoulder, the soft exhale that seemed both deliberate and unconscious. He remembered the way she had spoken once, quietly but firmly, commanding attention without raising, her voice making decisions that challenged him in ways no one else dared. She had vanished years ago, leaving nothing but absence and echoes, a ghost who had refused to be caught, who had refused to be possessed. And now, she was here, in his plane, in his proximity, carrying with her not only a child, but a silent accusation that everything he thought he had controlled might have been only an illusion. Markaram's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He could sense the careful calm in her movements, the invisible boundaries she drew without effort, and he felt the tug of a past he had long suppressed. Memories flickered. Fleeting moments of laughter, of arguments that never resolved, of nights spent staring into darkness where words had failed and where he had failed. There had been no closure, only the ache of absence, a lesson in power that had been cruelly incomplete. The child shifted slightly, dropping a small toy that rolled slowly across the aisle. Markaram's hand moved instinctively to pick it up, his touch deliberate yet hesitant, as if the air between them could shatter with the wrong movement. The child's eyes met his, searching, curious, intelligent beyond its years, and something inside Markaram twisted unexpectedly. He had stared down rival mob bosses without a twitch, had negotiated deals with lives dangling on the edge of a coin toss, but the weight of that gaze unsettled him completely. Lara's eyes flicked toward him briefly, catching the subtle shift in his demeanor, noting the way his fingers lingered over the toy before setting it down, and she felt a quiet acknowledgement pass between them. No words were spoken, yet the past surged forward in a current, invisible but undeniable. A decade of silence, of distance, of unspoken truths condensed into that single shared awareness. And Markaram realized, with a clarity that both terrified and enthralled him, that nothing would ever make this flight simple again. The plane tilted slightly as it gained altitude, engines vibrating with a ferocity that mirrored the chaos stirring inside him. He gripped the armrest, forcing himself to remain composed, even as memories clawed at the edges of his consciousness. He remembered the day she left, how empty the apartment had felt, how the walls had echoed with absence and regret he had refused to acknowledge. He had thought control was strength, distance was power. But now he recognized the subtle truth he had never admitted. Absence had been fear disguised as logic. The child shifted again, small fingers brushing against Lara's hand. Markaram watched, noting the tender, instinctive ways she guided him without command, without intervention. The past and present collided, creating a tension that made his chest feel heavier than any confrontation he had endured. It was a gravity he could not escape, pulling him toward a reckoning he had never anticipated. He glanced at Maddie, who sat opposite him, radiant in her calm, unaware of the subtle battle waging just a row away. He felt a flicker of guilt, a pang he couldn't define, and realized that even in the presence of a woman he respected and cared for, the pull of the past had the power to unsettle him completely. He had never allowed himself such vulnerability before. He had never had to, until now. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting a golden glow over the passengers, and Markaram noticed how every detail of Lara seemed designed to unsettle him, not through beauty alone, but through familiarity, through memory, through the silent knowledge of who he was beneath the armor. The child yawned quietly, brushing against Lara, and Markaram felt an inexplicable ache, a longing mingled with fear, and he wondered if he was ready to confront what he had buried so deeply. A faint smile flickered across Lara's face as she caught his gaze once more, subtle but deliberate, a reminder of the woman who had once challenged every assumption he had made about control, about loyalty, about love. The realization hit him then, as sharply as the ascent of the plane, that she had never really left him. She had simply changed the rules of engagement, hidden her power in plain sight, and now she held not only the past but a future that he could no longer define. Markaram leaned back, forcing his body to relax, yet every nerve remained alert. He knew the flight was long, that Spain awaited, that Maddie's presence was supposed to anchor him, yet he could not shake the feeling that the plane itself had become a vessel of reckoning. Every hum of the engine, every flicker of light across the cabin, every shuffle of a passenger's bag reminded him of the inescapable truth. His carefully ordered life had just collided with the consequences of choices he thought long buried. The first sip of water did little to calm him. His reflection in the window caught his eye, eyes sharp, alert, but shadowed by uncertainty. The man in the reflection, the feared, composed, unflinching Markaram, felt suddenly fragile, as though the balance he had maintained through years of blood and calculation was teetering on the edge of something he could neither predict nor control. A soft announcement over the intercom drew his attention back to the cabin. Flight attendants moved gracefully down the aisle, offering warmth, smiles, and distractions he could not allow himself to receive. His mind remained tethered to the presence beside him, to the child's quiet intelligence, to Lara's careful composure, and to the realization that this encounter was no accident, fate, chance, or design. He didn't know which, but he felt it keenly, like a pulse beneath his skin, relentless and insistent. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, small but sudden, and the cabin murmured with reaction. Markaram's hand instinctively tightened on the armrest, his eyes darting to Lara and the child. She glanced back at him, calm, unshaken, and he felt a strange admixture of relief and envy. How could she remain unshaken when his entire body responded to the slightest shift in the air? It was infuriating. It was magnetic. It was her. The thought came unbidden. What if everything he had built, every decision, every alliance, every calculation was meaningless in the face of her quiet power? What if the past he had spent years trying to control was alive and waiting, seated beside him, observing, judging, and silently demanding a reckoning he had not prepared for? The engines roared again, a reminder of momentum, of inevitable movement, and Markaram realized that the flight, the journey, the altitude, all were secondary to the silent confrontation unfolding in the space between them. He couldn't act, couldn't speak, yet he could not look away. The magnetic pull was too strong, the history too dense, and the consequences too immediate to ignore. He inhaled slowly, deliberately, feeling the subtle rise and fall of his chest, the tension in his shoulders, the ache in his stomach that had nothing to do with the meal just served. Lara's gaze flicked toward him one last time before she returned to her child, serene, unreadable, and he realized that she was already setting the terms. He would have to respond, but not yet. The reckoning would come in its own time, suspended between the sky and the truth, and there was nothing he could do to hasten it. And as the plane climbed higher, sunlight streaming across the cabin in warm ribbons, Markaram felt the past rise with it, sudden, undeniable, and alive. And he understood, with a clarity both terrifying and intoxicating, that nothing in his meticulously planned life would ever be simple again. 2. The moment Markaram's presence solidified in her peripheral vision, Lara felt the familiar tightening in her chest, a reaction she had spent years learning to control, to subdue beneath layers of careful composure. Spain had given her more than sunlit streets and quiet corners. It had given her solitude, autonomy, and the rare luxury of deciding her own pace, her own choices, without anyone questioning, manipulating, or dictating. She had arrived at this moment fully aware of the world around her, every nuance of tension, every subtle movement in the cabin, and yet her body betrayed her briefly with a flutter of memory she refused to acknowledge. She glanced down at her child, who was quietly drawing the edge of the seat with a small finger, completely absorbed in the lines and textures of the world he had known. His calmness contrasted sharply with the storm of emotions that Markaram's presence ignited in her. She marveled silently at his composure. He seemed too young to understand the gravity of the history between them, yet in his eyes was a quiet intelligence that always reminded her of the subtle power in observing before acting. She adjusted his blanket, smoothing it with practiced hands, reminding herself that here, in this moment, she was still the guardian of everything precious to her. Her posture remained perfect, a shield crafted over years of necessity. She had learned the language of control, of unreadable expressions, of silence as armor. A tilt of her head, a subtle lift of her chin, a hand resting lightly on the child's lap. All deliberate, all practiced. She could not afford to show surprise, awe, or fear, even though each of those emotions surged violently beneath the surface. The universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of timing, placing Markaram in her life once more when she had finally begun to breathe without the shadows of the past pressing down on her. She remembered clearly the nights she had lain awake, tracing the contours of memory like a map of danger and longing. The man beside her, who had once ruled her heart without effort, had also been the axis of her confinement, the reason she had had to make impossible choices. Spain had offered her refuge, a temporary exile where no one's power could dictate her steps, and she had vowed silently that no one, not Markaram, not anyone, would ever have that authority over her again. The child stirred, a small yawn escaping him, and Lara's gaze softened involuntarily. There was no hesitation in the way she protected him, no questioning of her instincts. She had made promises long before this day, promises not to surrender her agency, to ensure that no one could ever turn her son into a pawn in another person's ambitions. Yet even as she nurtured him quietly, her mind couldn't help but trace the outline of the man sitting only a few feet away, whose presence had always demanded attention, whose absence had left gaps she had struggled to fill in silence. Markaram had been more than a memory. He had been a force that shaped her decisions, subtly guiding her life without intention. His name had been spoken only in the privacy of her thoughts, never aloud, never to anyone. She had built walls around her heart so carefully, only to discover that proximity alone could tear at those defenses. She caught the slight twitch of his fingers as he adjusted in his seat, noticed the almost imperceptible shift in his shoulders, and it made her pulse quicken, even as she forced her face into unreadable calm. Her mind moved swiftly, calculating the emotional distance necessary to survive this encounter without succumbing to the past. She could not afford the luxury of sentimentality, not here, not now. Every breath, every glance, every small movement had to be precise, deliberate. Yet she felt the invisible pull of history between them, the tension of unspoken truths, suspended in the recycled cabin air, and she knew that despite years of careful preparation, nothing could erase the impact of this shared space. The child looked up suddenly, eyes meeting Markaram's across the aisle, and Lara's stomach twisted in subtle recognition of the silent acknowledgement passing between them. It was brief, fleeting, but it carried the weight of decades, of absence, of longing, of consequences neither of them had fully confronted. She reminded herself to remain steady, to keep the calm that had become her signature. Yet even as she did, she recognized that the universe had not granted her immunity from this collision of past and present. She inhaled slowly, letting the warmth of Spain's sunlight streaming through the window cloak her in a semblance of peace. She had chosen this life deliberately, for herself and for her son, and yet the presence of a man who had once commanded her heart without effort reminded her how easily even the most disciplined plans could falter. Lara had never been naive. She knew the stakes, the power of proximity, and the danger of emotion in someone who had been trained to observe, to dominate, to possess. Her fingers traced the edge of the child's toy absent-mindedly, a grounding gesture, a reminder that she still held control over something precious in a world designed to strip control from those who dared to love. She remembered vividly why she had vanished, why leaving had been her only real act of strength. It had not been fear, far from it. It had been foresight, the foresight to protect herself and her child from being used, from being claimed by a system of loyalty and power that demanded compliance and silence. The cabin shifted gently as the plane reached cruising altitude, a subtle vibration passing through the seats and into her chest. Lara allowed herself a fraction of relaxation, a fleeting acknowledgement that Spain, for all its challenges, offered breathing room, yet she could not let her guard down entirely. He was here. Markaram. The man who had once walked through her life like a force of nature, leaving footprints in places she had learned to heal. His presence was a current, subtle, yet insistent, that threatened to pull her into waters she had long avoided. She glanced briefly at his reflection in the window, catching the outline of his jaw, the strength in his shoulders, the eyes that had always seen too much and judged too little simultaneously. There was an intensity there, a pull that was impossible to resist, and Lara acknowledged silently that part of her still remembered the man behind the facade, the one who had held her heart in ways she had never allowed anyone else. Yet she did not falter. The child's quiet trust was her anchor, the knowledge of her own agency, her shield. Markaram shifted again, and she felt it in her chest like the subtle tremor of an earthquake before the first visible crack. The child noticed nothing, absorbed in his own world, yet Lara's mind raced. Years of distance, of building life on her own terms, suddenly felt precarious in the presence of someone who had once been more than a man. He had been a force that shaped her choices, her fears, her moments of joy and sorrow alike. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she assessed the situation. She could feel his gaze, not aggressive, not accusatory, but heavy, as though he had been searching for answers he didn't yet know how to ask. Lara's experience had taught her that the unspoken moments were often the most powerful, that silence carried weight far beyond words. She allowed the tension to exist without succumbing to it, maintaining composure while feeling the undercurrent of history flowing between them. The sun shifted outside, casting long, warm beams across the cabin, illuminating subtle features she hadn't consciously remembered. The slight curve of his brow, the strength in his jawline, the unyielding posture that had once intimidated and fascinated her simultaneously. She noted it all without flinching, reminding herself that her strength was not in ignorance, but in recognition, in control, in deliberate focus on what mattered. The life she had chosen, the child she nurtured, the independence she refused to surrender. A sudden movement from the aisle caught her attention. A flight attendant passed by with a gentle smile and a polite nod. Lara returned it with a measured tilt of her head, perfectly neutral, signaling nothing. Every interaction, every glance, every gesture had been rehearsed in her mind over countless years of survival. Yet no rehearsal could erase the impact of proximity, of shared history, of a past that hovered like a shadow over the present. She thought of the choices she had made, the life she had carved out for herself, the quiet victories that no one else would ever know. And yet, as Markaram's presence pressed against the edges of her consciousness, she understood that strength was not only about avoidance, strength was about presence, about knowing one's boundaries, about remaining unshaken even when every instinct screamed for chaos, confrontation, or surrender. The child's small hand brushed against hers briefly, a grounding reminder of responsibility, of love, of the stakes at hand. Lara focused on the warmth, the trust, the life she had nurtured in silence. She allowed herself a small inhale of satisfaction. She had succeeded in creating a life untouched by the manipulations of the past, even if only temporarily. Yet even in this fragile victory, the awareness of Markaram's gaze lingered. She could sense him noticing, calculating, observing. The subtle tension in the cabin was a quiet drumbeat, a measure of unspoken truths, of emotions suspended in the air, waiting for some small incident to tip the balance, to unravel or reinforce the carefully constructed walls she had built. A faint hum of the engines, a soft vibration beneath her seat, reminded Lara that the world outside moved relentlessly forward, uncaring of personal histories, desires, or fears. And yet here, in this small enclosed space, time seemed to stretch, compress, and twist around the presence of one man and a child who were both innocent and impossibly consequential in the life she had fought to preserve. She allowed a measured glance out the window. The clouds drifted lazily, distant, unreachable, free. The thought struck her sharply. She had become her own cloud, drifting without attachment, shaped by wind but not grounded by anyone's gravity, not even by the man who had once held her heart entirely in his hands. 3. The wooden toy slipped from the child's small fingers, tumbling slowly across the aisle, as if gravity itself had chosen this moment to remind Markaram that nothing in life was ever entirely predictable. His hand moved instinctively to catch it, the motion so automatic it felt like muscle memory from decades of training, of reflexes honed in the crucible of power, violence, and control. Yet as his fingers closed around the smooth wood, time seemed to stretch unnaturally, each heartbeat echoing in the silence between the soft hum of the engines and the distant rustle of passengers settling in. He froze, the weight of something unnameable settling heavily in his chest as the child's eyes lifted to meet his. Those eyes, wide, curious, quietly intelligent, held him hostage for a heartbeat that stretched longer than he would have imagined possible. It was not fear, nor challenge, nor accusation. It was recognition without explanation, an unspoken understanding that unsettled him completely. He had stared down death and betrayal without flinching, negotiated with men who wielded empires like swords, and yet the calm, measured gaze of a small child sitting in the seat beside the woman who had once held his heart unmade him entirely. The toy rested lightly in his hand, suddenly heavier than its size or weight should allow. Every instinct screamed at him to act, to speak, to intervene, yet the rules of this encounter were entirely unfamiliar. No threat was present, no danger to calculate, only the quiet, patient presence of a child whose innocence seemed to demand something he had not felt in years. Patience, observation, restraint, and the recognition that some forces could not be dominated, controlled, or predicted. Lara's sharp eyes followed him discreetly, noting the almost imperceptible shift in his breathing, the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his hand lingered over the toy, as though the act of returning it required negotiation with some internal truth he could not yet name. She did not flinch, did not speak, did not move. She had prepared herself for this moment, had rehearsed control and patience and calm, yet even she recognized the gravity of the exchange. The past was alive in the space between them, demanding attention, threading through the present with quiet insistence. Markaram's hand finally released the toy, letting it fall gently into the child's lap. The motion was slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if acknowledging that some things could no longer be taken casually, that some interactions carried weight far beyond their immediate context. The child accepted it without fanfare, eyes briefly flicking to Markaram before returning to the small wooden figure. Yet in that glance, Markaram felt a resonance, a silent connection that both alarmed and fascinated him. He inhaled slowly, aware that his usual mechanisms of control, command, intimidation, calculation, were entirely irrelevant here. The presence of the child, the subtle authority in their gaze, the quiet intensity of observation reminded him that not everything in life could be dominated. Some things simply existed, demanding recognition, respect, and emotional engagement. His chest tightened, a foreign and unwelcome sensation, as he realized the depth of what he was feeling, unsettled, exposed, compelled by history and connection he had believed long buried. Lara adjusted her posture imperceptibly, hands lightly resting on the child's shoulders. She had vanished years ago for this reason, had protected herself and her child from becoming pawns in a life ruled by ambition and control. Yet even as she maintained her exterior calm, she recognized the subtle cracks in Markaram's composure, the way the sight of her child stirred echoes of a past he had tried desperately to suppress. It was proof of what she had always known: some bonds, once formed, cannot be destroyed by absence or time. The child tilted the toy slightly, examining it as though testing it against invisible rules, and Markaram found himself watching every movement with meticulous attention. The boy's intelligence was quiet, understated, yet undeniable. In the way he considered, paused, and responded, Markaram recognized the faint outline of Lara in miniature, sharp observation, careful consideration, and the patience that comes from knowing the world will only reveal itself to those willing to see beyond surface appearances. A flicker of memory surfaced unbidden: the laughter of Lara in a sunlit room, the small arguments that had once seemed monumental, the nights of quiet reflection and unspoken tension. And he realized with a shock that these memories were not mere ghosts. They were living presences, resurrected by proximity and the quiet, probing gaze of the child who now sat between them. The realization twisted inside him, unfamiliar and unnerving. Power, control, fear, all the tools he had relied upon were irrelevant here. He returned his focus to the child, who had now carefully traced the edge of the toy with small fingers, noting every detail. Markaram's mind cataloged the precision and deliberateness of movement as if analyzing a threat, yet the child was no threat. The intensity, the quiet authority, the innate intelligence displayed was entirely natural, yet it carried implications Markaram could not yet define. He felt himself drawn into a current of awareness he could not resist, a silent recognition that this encounter would not end without transformation. Lara's gaze shifted toward him again, steady, unreadable, and he felt the weight of her observation. She did not need to speak. The subtle acknowledgement in her eyes conveyed everything that words could not: awareness, control, readiness, and the quiet certainty that she had survived, that she had protected herself and her child, that she had anticipated this moment. And yet, even with preparation, she did not fully expect the impact of proximity, the undeniable pull of the past reasserting itself in ways neither of them could ignore. Markaram's jaw tightened slightly, his mind racing to reconcile the impossible juxtaposition of strength, vulnerability, and innocence before him. Every detail was magnified: the tilt of the child's head, the careful way Lara's fingers rested on the boy's shoulder, the subtle inflection of tension in her posture. He recognized the battlefield of emotion that lay ahead, one with no rules, no weapons, no allies. Only the delicate negotiation of presence, recognition, and subtle influence. The toy shifted slightly in the child's lap, and Markaram's eyes followed, noting the care, the attention, the intent. It was mesmerizing. In the way the child interacted with the object, Markaram recognized traces of Lara's methods, her deliberate patience, her unspoken insistence on observation before action. It was unnerving, because he realized that her strength had been passed on quietly, invisibly, shaping a life that now intersected with his own in ways he could not control. He studied her face again, noting the faint lines that spoke of endurance, the glow of survival, the careful calibration of every expression to maintain calm and authority. Lara had vanished to protect herself, to protect the child, yet even absence had not been enough to erase the connection between them. That connection was silent, persistent, alive in the child, in her presence, in the quiet space between seats, in the unspoken recognition that some things are immutable. Markaram's chest tightened as he realized the gravity of the situation. He could no longer rely on instinct alone. This was not a confrontation of power or intellect, but of emotion, memory, and history. Every heartbeat carried meaning, every breath carried consequence, and he felt the rare, almost alien sensation of vulnerability. He had never been this exposed, this unprepared, yet he could not look away. The child's eyes flicked to him again, bright and unflinching, and Markaram felt a twist deep inside, something unfamiliar, urgent, and demanding. It was not love, nor guilt, nor fear alone. It was recognition, raw and unmediated, of a bond that had existed long before calculation or strategy. It demanded attention, reflection, and the quiet acceptance that some connections transcend control, influence, and time. Lara shifted slightly, keeping the child between them, her hands steady, her posture unreadable, and Markaram felt the subtle pull of her presence. She had survived, thrived, and endured, and yet here she was, calm, patient, unshaken, reminding him that strength could be quiet, deliberate, and infinitely more formidable than any act of violence he had ever committed. He inhaled slowly, attempting to center himself, yet every nerve, every sense, every heartbeat was drawn to the small triangle of presence formed by Lara, the child, and himself. The cabin, the engines, the sunlight, all fell away into background insignificance. Only the unspoken tension, the silent acknowledgement, the unnamed feeling that had surfaced unbidden remained, pulsing with inevitability. The child tilted his head, frowning slightly as if testing Markaram, and the man felt a sudden awareness. This was not merely a meeting of past and present. It was a confrontation of legacies, of strength, intelligence, and choice passed down in quiet, unspoken ways. The toy, the glance, the silence, all carried significance beyond what either of them could articulate, and Markaram understood that this encounter would linger long after the flight ended. Markaram released a slow breath, his hands folding over his lap, conscious of every small movement, every nuance of attention. Lara's gaze remained calm, the child's attention unwavering, and he felt the subtle shift of understanding settle like sediment in his mind. Some moments do not announce themselves. They arrive quietly, imperceptibly, and insist on being felt. He could not ignore it, could not suppress it, and he knew, with the slow certainty of a man who had survived everything, that his life had irrevocably changed in these suspended minutes. And as the plane hummed steadily above the clouds, Markaram felt the truth, pressing softly but insistently against his chest. Some connections, no matter how long absent, no matter how carefully avoided, do not wait for permission. They exist. They demand to be recognized. They demand to be felt. And he, for the first time in years, felt entirely terrifyingly and irrevocably exposed. 4. Markaram did not speak. He did not move beyond the careful motions dictated by the cabin's rhythm. He simply observed, letting the world narrow to the triangle of presence that mattered most: Lara, the child, and himself. Every subtle motion of the child's hands, every quiet blink, every tilt of the head seemed magnified, carrying weight and meaning that had nothing to do with his usual calculations. Normally, he could read intentions, threats, even hidden agendas. But this was different. This was something that defied his expertise, something that had no map or precedent. He watched Lara's fingers brush the child's hair back, noticed the slight tension in her jaw as she measured his attention, and felt the pull of understanding slowly unfold in him. It was not immediate, nor loud, nor dramatic. It did not scream for acknowledgement. Instead, it crept in like a shadow stretching across the sunlit floor of the cabin, subtle, persistent, and impossible to ignore. The realization settled over him gently, yet firmly, leaving a space within him that had long been occupied by certainty. Markaram's eyes traced the child's gestures as if trying to decode a language he had never learned but had always known existed. The way the boy reached for the toy, the deliberate patience with which he examined it, the way his small fingers lingered on the edges before releasing it, all of it suggested an intelligence, a presence, and a calmness that unsettled Markaram because it reminded him too much of Lara. He recognized her methods, her patience, her deliberate attention passed down silently to this small, living extension of her strength. He shifted subtly in his seat, careful not to draw attention to himself, yet each subtle adjustment seemed amplified under Lara's watchful gaze. She had always been able to read him with frightening precision, and here, years later, with a child now part of the equation, she was even more untouchable. The quiet assembling of truth behind his eyes, the slowly knitting together of the past, present, and the silent implications of the child's existence, was something Lara anticipated but never rushed. She had learned long ago that some revelations must arrive on their own, organically, for them to take root. The child looked up suddenly, meeting Markaram's gaze with an intensity that startled him. He realized in that instant that the boy was more than an observer. He was a catalyst, a subtle messenger of history that demanded acknowledgement. His own pulse quickened, though he did not allow it to show. Years of control, discipline, and the ability to command attention failed him now. He was learning, painfully, that some forces, especially human ones, could not be tamed by authority alone. Lara's posture remained composed, her expression unreadable, yet every small movement was deliberate. She had calculated this moment countless times in her mind over years of absence, predicting that if they ever met again, Markaram would not react with confrontation or accusation. He would observe, analyze, hesitate. And that is exactly what she saw happening now. Her understanding of him, refined through years of intimate knowledge and painful awareness, allowed her to remain calm. She did not need to intervene. She only needed to exist, to allow the slow process of realization to unfold as it must. Markaram's mind raced, even as his face remained calm. He catalogued every subtle shift in the child's expression, every nuance in Lara's posture, every minor pause in their breathing patterns. A timeline began to assemble itself in his consciousness, one that he had never intended to create but could not resist. The child's presence, the toy, the quiet observation, Lara's composure, all of it mapped a story that was more powerful than any instruction, any command, any carefully laid plan he had executed in his life. He felt a twinge of guilt, a small, uncomfortable awareness that the world he had built, the empire he controlled, and the people he commanded had always operated under principles he now recognized as hollow, without human connection. Lara had understood this long before he did. She had vanished not out of fear or weakness, but because she could see the machinery of his world, the control, the subtle manipulations, the invisible strings. and had refused to allow herself or her child to become a tool. Markaram's hand tightened briefly on the armrest, almost without his awareness. He had never experienced confrontation in this quiet, patient, deliberate form. His usual opponents had shouted, bargained, fought. Here, he faced truth, delivered silently, in gestures, in pauses, in the mere fact of existence. Lara had never abandoned him out of ignorance or miscalculation. She had made a strategic decision to step away, to protect herself, and to shape her life without the interference of his power. He swallowed slowly, acknowledging the subtle ache of recognition. The child reached for another small object on the tray table, turning it thoughtfully in tiny hands, and Markaram realized that every small act of observation was reinforcing the lesson he had yet to fully articulate even to himself. Control, he understood suddenly, was not about dominance. It was about responsibility, presence, and awareness. And Lara had understood that while he had been busy mastering control over others, she'd been mastering it over herself. The plane hummed steadily above the clouds, the steady vibration beneath the seats providing a rhythm against which all these realizations played out. Markaram's gaze never left the child, who continued quietly examining the toy, each small movement deliberate, thoughtful, precise. He realized uncomfortably that the child's patience, intelligence, and calmness mirrored Lara's own traits. They were not merely inherited features, they were lessons, instilled without words, passing silently from mother to child, a subtle demonstration of power that no empire could replicate. Lara allowed herself the smallest, imperceptible exhale, noting the subtle shifts in Markaram's body language. His attention had become fixed, unblinking, as he worked unconsciously to assemble the timeline, to understand the implications, to reconcile the past with this present moment. She had never feared confrontation. She had only feared the misuse of her agency, the reduction of her choices, the manipulation of her life and her child's. Now, observing the slow unraveling of his assumptions, she felt a quiet sense of justice in the natural unfolding of truth. Markaram's jaw tightened slightly as realization deepened. He had always equated control with power, obedience with loyalty, and authority with respect. Yet here, in the unspoken dialogue between Lara, the child, and himself, he understood that influence without consent, power without recognition, and presence without understanding were hollow. He was witnessing, in real time, the quiet endurance of someone who had survived and thrived without needing him, without asking for him, and without allowing his past to dictate their present. The child tilted his head and offered a faint, curious glance, and Markaram felt a pang he could neither define nor resist. It was the recognition of connection, the awareness of consequences long delayed, the realization that some truths are never forced. They arrive naturally, at the pace they are meant to, and only then are fully absorbed. Lara had understood this. He was only now beginning to grasp it. Lara's fingers rested lightly on the child's arm, guiding without dominating, protecting without suffocating, and Markaram noted every subtle detail. She had taught him, silently, a lesson decades in the making: the strength of restraint, the power of observation, the necessity of patience, the child's calm demeanor, the deliberate examination of the toy, the quiet intelligence reflected in his gaze. All of it was a mirror, a reflection of Lara's choices, her foresight, and the truth she had carried silently for years. Markaram exhaled softly, a nearly imperceptible release, and felt the weight of unspoken understanding settle in him. He had not confronted Lara, had not demanded answers, had not accused. Instead, he had observed, and in doing so, had begun to recognize the subtle contours of truth that existed between them. He understood now that the world she had inhabited, the life she had built, and the child she had nurtured were all part of a deliberate strategy: survival, strength, and agency. The cabin lights shifted slightly as the sun moved across the sky, and Markaram's gaze remained fixed. He understood that this encounter was not a moment of power or confrontation, but a lesson delivered quietly, insistently, with the precision of time itself. Lara had chosen not to explain, not because she sought mystery, but because she knew that truth, when forced, was often rejected. Only when it emerged naturally, understood in its own rhythm, did it gain meaning and permanence. Markaram realized finally that he had spent years seeking control over external forces, over people, over circumstances, yet the most profound lesson in his life had arrived silently, without fanfare, without confrontation, without declaration. He had been forced to observe, to reflect, to recognize the invisible threads connecting past decisions, present choices, and the inevitable consequences. The child, Lara, the quiet moments between breaths, all had delivered a truth he could neither ignore nor resist. He exhaled again, slower, deeper, and felt the first real shift in his awareness. Control was not about domination. Influence was not about command. Power was not about fear. Presence, patience, understanding, and respect. These were the true markers of strength. Lara had lived this truth every day, and now he had no choice but to reckon with it. The child's small fingers brushed against the toy again, deliberately, thoughtfully, and Markaram noted the subtle echo of Lara's own meticulous methods. The recognition struck him fully. She had always been prepared, always one step ahead, and her absence had not been weakness. It had been foresight, deliberate and calculated. And now, in this quiet, unspoken exchange, he understood the depth of her intelligence, the scope of her planning, and the enduring strength that had allowed her to survive in a world designed to consume the unprepared. Markaram's lips pressed into a thin line as realization deepened further. His inner circle, his advisors, those who had thought her disappearance was a problem to be solved, had underestimated her entirely. They had assumed she could be controlled, used, manipulated, or broken, but she had vanished with foresight, intention, and agency. She had foreseen the consequences of visibility, of proximity, of exposure, and had acted decisively to protect herself and the child. Every gesture, every glance, every subtle motion in the cabin reinforced the slow, insistent assembly of truth within him. He had never faced a lesson like this, delivered not in words, not in confrontation, but in quiet observation, patient endurance, and deliberate action. He understood in that moment that some realizations do not arrive loudly. They arrive with quiet insistence, with subtle accumulation, and only when the observer is ready to absorb them fully. Markaram's gaze softened ever so slightly as he observed the child's focus, Lara's composure, and the subtle interplay of presence and silence that defined the moment. He recognized the lesson. Strength is not always loud, not always visible, not always immediate. Sometimes it is the quiet, deliberate, patient accumulation of choices, attention, and foresight. And in this cabin, suspended between sky and earth, he was a witness to a truth he could no longer ignore. The sun dipped slightly, casting long shadows across the aisle, and Markaram felt the subtle weight of understanding settle fully. The child's quiet intelligence, Lara's deliberate calm, the unspoken dialogue between them all. These were markers of a life carefully constructed, a past carefully navigated, and a present deliberately managed. He had been forced to observe, to reflect, and to recognize that some truths must arrive naturally, or else they are rejected. And now, finally, he understood. 5. Maddie sat quietly, her posture impeccable, yet every instinct within her vibrated with awareness. She noticed the pauses first, the slight hesitation in Markaram's glance when he shifted his eyes across the cabin, the way his hand lingered for just a fraction longer than necessary on the armrest, and the subtle tension in his shoulders that spoke of unacknowledged conflict. She had spent years learning to read people, to perceive even the tiniest deviations from habit, and now every line on his face, every shadow in his expression, was screaming a truth that had no words. The warmth of the Spanish sun filtered through the cabin windows, catching in her hair, falling softly across her skin, yet it could not warm her heart in this moment. She felt a quiet tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. The shift in Markaram's attention was imperceptible to anyone else, but not to her. She sensed the invisible thread that tethered his mind elsewhere, the way his thoughts seemed to reach for someone, some past that existed beyond her, beyond the narrative she thought she had been part of. Maddie did not require confession. She did not need words or explanations. She had learned long ago that human emotion cannot be contained within language alone. It reveals itself in subtle movements, in fleeting glances, in the almost imperceptible drift of attention. And what she saw was unmistakable. Markaram's heart was elsewhere, his soul quietly tugged by a presence that had existed long before she arrived in his life. Love, she understood, is not always loud. Sometimes it is a silent force, powerful enough to bend decisions, dictate behavior, and reshape priorities without ever announcing itself. And Markaram, with all his control, all his power, all his carefully constructed walls, could not conceal it from her. Not now, not ever. She observed how he glanced at Lara, then down at the child, the subtle recognition that passed between them almost unspoken, but entirely undeniable. There was no conversation, no drama, no spectacle. Yet everything was being communicated in the space between them, in the quiet acknowledgement of what had been, what was, and what could never be erased. Maddie's gaze followed each motion, each subtle cue, and she understood with unerring clarity. She was witnessing a story that did not include her in its heart, no matter the surface appearances. The silence between Markaram and Lara spoke volumes. It was a quiet, deliberate tension, layered with history, patience, and understanding that had grown through years of distance. The child's presence amplified it, a living testament to decisions and sacrifices she could not undo. Maddie felt her chest tighten slightly, a brief, almost imperceptible pang of sorrow for herself, though she knew she would not yield to it. She had never believed in taking a place where she was not fully wanted. Her own dignity demanded action, but not dramatic action. No confrontation, no outburst, no accusation. She simply observed, recognized, and prepared to leave. Stepping away was not an act of weakness. It was an act of clarity, a silent affirmation of self-respect. She understood the fragility of love, unanchored by truth, and she refused to be a decoration, a placeholder, or a silent witness in a life defined by someone else's unfinished narrative. Maddie's movements were deliberate as she rose from her seat. Every motion spoke of composure, every gesture of quiet strength. She packed her belongings methodically, avoiding unnecessary noise, and felt the soft warmth of Spain's air filter through the cabin as the plane glided steadily above the clouds. Each step she took was measured, mindful of her dignity, aware of the eyes that might linger on her, but determined not to seek acknowledgement or validation. As she moved down the aisle, she observed Markaram once more. His eyes followed her with a faint awareness, but he said nothing. He did not protest. He did not command. He simply existed, a man confronted with an emotion he could not immediately control, and she recognized it. The hesitation, the acknowledgement of loss, and the silent admission that he had not anticipated her exit. This was a moment not of confrontation, but of truth, subtle and unyielding. The child, meanwhile, remained quietly seated, absorbed in the toy, yet aware of the subtle shifts in energy around him. Maddie recognized the delicate balance in this trio: history, innocence, and unspoken love intersecting with present awareness. She felt a pang of envy for the clarity and patience of the child who had yet to carry the weight of complex adult emotion, yet she did not let it weaken her resolve. Her steps remained steady, her composure intact, as she moved closer to the exit. Markaram's attention flickered again, drawn involuntarily toward the subtle gestures of departure, but he did not speak. Words would not have sufficed. Any declaration would have been too little. Too late, and Maddie knew this instinctively. She did not require explanation. She required acknowledgement of her own worth. That acknowledgement could not come from his recognition of her presence in his life. It had to come from herself. As the cabin lights flickered subtly with the changing angle of sunlight, Maddie felt the strange duality of relief and sorrow. She had loved deeply, fully, and without reservation, yet she recognized when a story was not hers to inhabit. Her exit was quiet, intentional, and dignified, a demonstration that strength is often silent and departure can be more powerful than confrontation. She passed Lara and the child without hesitation, feeling a curious mixture of respect and distance. There was no animosity, only recognition of the inevitable truth. The past could not be rewritten, and Markaram's heart had always carried remnants of it. She understood the fragility of human emotion, the subtle dynamics of unspoken bonds, and the importance of choosing one's own path rather than clinging to a narrative where she was peripheral. The gentle hum of the engines underscored the silent drama unfolding within her, a rhythm that matched the cadence of her resolve. She held her head high, her posture unwavering, every step affirming her autonomy. The Spanish air, warm and comforting, seemed to embrace her as she moved away, reinforcing the clarity of her decision. Pride, she realized, was not a loud proclamation, but a quiet, steadfast companion. She walked toward the door, feeling the weight of observation from behind. Markaram's glance, Lara's composed eyes, the child's subtle awareness. Yet she did not falter. The exit was not an abandonment of care, nor a rejection of connection. It was an acknowledgement of reality, a recognition that some truths, some stories, cannot be forced into alignment. Her hand brushed the latch of the door lightly, and the soft click as it opened resonated like the punctuation of a chapter ending. She inhaled deeply, tasting freedom and clarity in equal measure, aware that every moment of observation, every subtle glance exchanged behind her, would remain in memory. She would carry it with grace, letting it inform her strength rather than define her sorrow. As the warm air of Spain enveloped her outside the cabin, Maddie paused briefly, allowing herself one fleeting glance back. Markaram remained seated, his composure returning, yet the subtle shift in his posture spoke volumes to anyone attuned to observation. She smiled faintly, a quiet, private acknowledgement that the story unfolding around him was no longer hers to inhabit, and yet she had chosen wisely, firmly, and with dignity. The plane continued its flight above clouds and sky, silent witness to a departure that spoke louder than any words. Maddie felt the subtle exhilaration of freedom, the weightless confidence of someone who had chosen authenticity over pretense, truth over convenience, and self-respect over attachment. She walked steadily, her presence commanding in its quiet authority, leaving behind a narrative that could not contain her integrity. The cabin air shifted subtly as Lara finally broke her silence, her voice calm, measured, and deliberate. She did not speak with defensiveness, nor with a rush of emotion, though the weight of years pressed quietly in her chest. Her words carried precision, each syllable selected to convey truth without excess, honesty without vulnerability she could not control. Markaram's attention, previously caught in observation and tentative reflection, now sharpened fully, drawn into the orbit of her declaration. "I didn't leave because I was afraid of your enemies." she said first, letting the statement settle between them. There was no accusation, no explanation, no embellishment, only the quiet assertion of a decision made with intention and foresight. Markaram remained, silent, studying her with an intensity that betrayed both curiosity and restraint. The engines hummed steadily, a neutral background to the gravity of the confession, yet nothing could distract him from the sudden clarity piercing through layers of past assumptions. Her gaze held his, steady and unwavering, a quiet reminder of the depth of her resolve. I left because your future, your empire, your plans, everything surrounding your life was being negotiated around me, she continued. Each word landed deliberately, each phrase echoing with meaning that could not be ignored. Markaram's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He had spent years believing he controlled every element of his life, that every decision was measured, precise, and unavoidable. Yet he felt sharply and uncomfortably that he had never considered her perspective. She let a brief pause settle between them, allowing him to absorb the implications. Her silence was deliberate, almost a mirror of the calm she had cultivated over years of careful survival. It was not dramatic. It was not performative. It was full of the weight of decisions made with intention, courage, and foresight. Markaram felt the tension in his chest, the sudden awareness that the story he had assumed to control had been unfolding with a narrative he had never truly seen. My advisors, she continued softly, had already planned the succession, the obedience, the permanence of your world, and it was all tied to the child I carried. The words landed with a quiet precision that stilled the small noises of the cabin, compelling attention, forcing comprehension. Markaram's gaze flicked involuntarily to the child, then back to her, a knot of unspoken understanding forming in the space between breaths. She did not need to dramatize her absence. She did not need to justify her choices with anger, sorrow, or recrimination. The truth itself was more compelling than any display of emotion could have been. Markaram, accustomed to control, to dominance, to the ability to shape perception and circumstance, felt the subtle sting of realization. This was not abandonment. This was foresight. This was leadership executed quietly, deliberately, without spectacle. Lara's hand brushed slightly against the child's arm, a small gesture of protection and reassurance. The child, calm and aware, seemed to understand intuitively the importance of this moment. Markaram observed the silent connection, the unspoken bond that had been cultivated not through power or coercion, but through foresight, care, and deliberate restraint. The realization struck him fully. The child was not just a part of her life. The child was part of the strategy that had preserved both of them. Her voice remained steady, controlled, imbued with authority that did not need to be loud. If I had stayed visible, she explained, I would have become leverage. The child would have become a chain, silent but unbreakable, binding both of us to circumstances we could not control. She let the words linger, watching as the truth settled slowly into Markaram's awareness. The engines roared softly, a gentle counterpoint to the storm of comprehension unfolding in his mind. Markaram swallowed, the tightness in his throat almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. He had always equated absence with weakness, with cowardice, with betrayal. And yet, Lara's calculated departure, executed without drama or spectacle, revealed a truth far more formidable. Strength, intelligence, and foresight need not announce themselves. They simply exist, quietly, immutably, shaping outcomes long before anyone notices. The child shifted slightly, tugging gently at a small toy, his innocence juxtaposed against the gravity of the adult revelations unfolding around him. Markaram watched closely, realizing in that instant that the child's calm awareness mirrored Lara's own deliberate patience. The boy's presence had been her strategy from the beginning, a living testament to foresight, preparation, and careful navigation of a world where power could be weaponized against those who were unaware. Lara's eyes softened fractionally, though her composure remained intact. She had made sacrifices, assumed risks, and executed plans without needing recognition, without expecting acknowledgement. Markaram felt the first real stirrings of awe mixed with regret. Awe at the depth of her intelligence and planning, regret that he had never fully understood, never truly observed, never anticipated that her absence was a choice, not a retreat. "The moment I disappeared," she continued, "I did not vanish out of fear. I vanished to ensure survival. I vanished to guarantee that we, both of us, the child and I, would exist independently, without becoming pawns in a narrative we did not consent to." Her words struck with quiet power, each syllable cutting through the illusions of control that Markaram had long relied upon. He realized painfully that he had never experienced a force so deliberately resilient, so intentionally unassailable as the mind and will of Lara. He shifted slightly, the tension in his chest pressing like a weight he could not remove. He had always believed power, fear, and dominance could dictate outcomes. But here, before him, was proof of another truth. Foresight, agency, and intelligence could outmaneuver authority, outlast strategy, and endure beyond the reach of control. Lara had demonstrated this with silence, with absence, and with the careful cultivation of independence. Markaram's eyes flicked to the child once more. The boy's calm, deliberate attention, his quiet intelligence, was a reflection of Lara's strategy. Subtle, unspoken, and completely effective. He understood suddenly the full scale of her decision. Her disappearance had been a calculated act of preservation, leadership, and foresight. The world might have seen absence as retreat, but he now recognized it as mastery, executed with quiet precision and deliberate foresight. She paused, allowing the weight of her explanation to settle fully. No dramatic gestures, no tearful confessions, no pleadings, only the clarity of truth, laid bare, undeniable, and quietly compelling. Markaram inhaled slowly, recognizing perhaps for the first time that the woman before him had never been someone to surrender to circumstance, to expectation, or to the whims of a world ruled by power. She had ruled herself, and in doing so, had preserved both her life and the life of her child. He exhaled sharply, a subtle release of tension he had not realized he had been holding. Power, the kind he had spent decades cultivating, planning, and enforcing, suddenly felt small in comparison to the quiet, deliberate mastery displayed here. He had confronted enemies, manipulated systems, and commanded fear, yet none of that preparation could contend with foresight executed with intelligence, patience, and restraint. Lara had demonstrated that the truest form of power was the one that required no proclamation. Her gaze softened for the briefest of moments, acknowledging both him and the child, and in that instant, Markaram recognized the depth of her sacrifice and strategy. This was not a story of abandonment or weakness. It was a story of foresight, leadership, and deliberate action that ensured autonomy, survival, and strength. He realized, with a mix of admiration, regret, and astonishment, that he had underestimated her entirely, and that his assumptions had blinded him to the quiet genius of her choices. The plane hummed steadily above the clouds, indifferent to the revelations unfolding inside the cabin, yet Markaram felt as if the air itself had shifted. He had never been confronted with truth delivered in such subtle, unassailable fashion. He understood now that Lara's absence, her silence, and her deliberate vanishing were not failures of loyalty or love. They were acts of intelligence, courage, and preservation, executed flawlessly. Markaram's chest tightened as comprehension deepened. He had wielded power for decades, but never faced a challenge like this. The truth of foresight, presence, and deliberate action. Lara had vanished not to escape him, but to reclaim control, to assert independence, and to ensure that neither she nor her child could be used as instruments in someone else's narrative. The clarity of that decision, delivered calmly, honestly, and without spectacle, left him unsettled, captivated, and aware of his own limitations in a way he had never experienced. The child shifted in his seat, innocently yet perceptively, holding the small wooden toy with careful attention. Markaram realized that this presence, this innocence, was both a reminder and a tool, silently reinforcing the lessons Lara had orchestrated through absence and discretion. The boy's calm composure mirrored Lara's strategy perfectly, deliberate, patient, and unassailable. Lara's voice, still soft, carried a final weight. Leadership, strength, and foresight are more important than romance, Markaram. I chose the path that ensured survival for both of us. That is why I left. Her words echoed in the cabin, not as accusation, not as confession, but as undeniable truth. Markaram understood, finally, fully and uncomfortably, that he had witnessed not abandonment, but a masterful act of strategy and care, executed silently, effectively, and irrevocably. Spain had a rhythm that was foreign to Markaram at first. There were no alarms to silence, no urgent demands that needed immediate attention, no whispers of power to decipher or orders to execute. The streets moved with a languid cadence, sunlight spilled across cobblestones in irregular patterns, and the scent of the sea mingled with jasmine, drifting from quiet balconies. For a man accustomed to controlling everything, the sensation was disorienting, yet strangely liberating. He'd always measured time by decisions and results, by control and consequence. Yet here, the minutes flowed, without expectation, and for the first time, he had no plan. At first, it felt like wandering without purpose. He walked through narrow streets with his hands in his pockets, observing small details, the way a shopkeeper arranged fresh fruit, the way children laughed without calculation, the rhythm of a dog trotting behind its owner. He realized he had never truly seen these details before, never allowed himself to notice the small constancies that made life tangible rather than a game of strategy. There was no agenda, no mission, and no authority to assert, just existence. He did not chase Lara. He did not demand her attention or insist upon recognition. Instead, he allowed himself to witness her strength, to watch her navigate her environment and her life with careful deliberation. She moved with quiet confidence, always aware yet never performative, guiding the child through daily routines with patience and firmness. Every small gesture spoke of competence and resilience, a subtle correction here, a guiding hand there, a soft word of encouragement that carried authority without dominance. Markaram began to notice how the child responded to him, not with obedience, not with fear, not with expectation, but with cautious curiosity. It was a lesson in humility. Warmth, presence, and consistency mattered far more than authority. The boy tested him in subtle ways, a glance, a pause, a question that demanded thought rather than reaction, and Markaram learned, slowly and without acknowledgement, that the foundation of trust could not be commanded. It had to be earned through patience, attention, and quiet respect. Lara watched him closely, though she did not interfere. Her eyes followed him in subtle, non-intrusive ways, as if monitoring his growth without claiming it or directing it. Markaram understood this without needing to ask. Love, he realized, was not a conquest. It did not return through effort alone, nor could it be demanded through power. It softened its way back, incrementally, through patience, humility, and consistent demonstration of worth. Every small choice he made, every moment of restraint contributed to the gradual rebuilding of trust. He sat in cafes, observing life passing by, learning how to breathe without purpose, how to let silence linger, how to watch without intervention. At first, it made him restless. Every muscle in his body was trained to move with intention, to command the world, to shape outcomes. But Spain's rhythm forced a reckoning, to move slowly, to notice, to exist without need. It was a subtle discipline, one he had never known, and it revealed weaknesses and gaps he had long ignored. He noticed how Lara allowed the child to assert small choices. Which toy to play with, which snack to eat, which street to turn down. Decisions that seemed inconsequential, yet carried lessons in autonomy and self-respect. He realized he had never truly allowed anyone to exercise agency in his world without being measured, evaluated, or corrected. And here, observing her, witnessing the quiet authority of her guidance, he began to understand the quiet, transformative power of patience. Each day brought incremental change. Markaram no longer sought to control the environment, the schedule, or even the child's movements. He simply became present, attentive, and reliable. And slowly, imperceptibly, he began to notice Lara's reactions. She relaxed marginally in his presence, a fleeting ease in her posture, a quiet acknowledgement of his consistent, non-intrusive attention. Love did not return fully, not yet, but the subtle signs were there, a glance that lingered, a soft word, a trust that unfolded at its own pace. He reflected often on the difference between presence and possession. He had spent years equating authority with love, control with affection, and influence with attachment. Spain taught him otherwise. By simply observing, by practicing patience, by allowing space, he discovered that connection flourished not under domination, but under quiet, steady investment. Trust could not be commanded, and love could not be coerced. Both had to be nurtured through consistency, respect, and time. The child grew familiar with him, offering small tokens of curiosity and engagement. A question, a shy smile, a gesture that required acknowledgement rather than direction. Markaram learned to respond without instruction, to engage without control, and to guide without imposing dominance. In doing so, he discovered a satisfaction that had nothing to do with power. The quiet fulfillment of earning trust and witnessing growth without interference. Lara, ever observant, allowed him this learning process, subtly testing boundaries, noting changes, yet never rushing, never insisting, never betraying impatience. Markaram understood that her caution was a gift, a measure of trust, and a reflection of her own experience with control and autonomy. He was learning not to manipulate, not to demand, but to exist in a way that was worthy of her acknowledgement. The Spanish evenings were long, golden, and filled with warmth. They walked along cobblestone streets at dusk, the child running ahead in bursts of laughter, Lara following, and Markaram trailing with deliberate care. Every step, every glance, every silence was imbued with learning. He noticed patterns in her gestures, the rhythm of her attention, the subtle ways she allowed the child to test boundaries without restriction. It was a quiet education in humility, observation, and the art of slow, deliberate presence. Markaram began to realize that his usual methods, intimidation, planning, decisiveness, were irrelevant here. This world required a different kind of mastery, emotional patience, thoughtful observation, and quiet consistency. His mind, trained for control, now wrestled with restraint, and the discomfort was part of the lesson. True strength lay in the ability to exist without dominance, to engage without authority, to build without imposing. He observed Lara during conversations with locals, noticing her blend of firmness and warmth, her ability to command respect without asserting power, her subtle humor that drew people toward her. He realized he had never known this combination of influence and grace, this delicate balance of presence without possession. She had taught the child well, and in watching them together, he glimpsed a life structured not around fear, control, or authority, but around understanding, patience, and subtle guidance. Markaram found himself reflecting at night, sitting quietly on the balcony of the villa, the distant waves of the Spanish coast below. The sun had set hours ago, but the warmth lingered, mingling with a new awareness within him. He thought of his past, of the ways he had measured life by domination, of the mistakes made in the name of control. Here, in Spain, he saw a different path, the path of observation, patience, and quiet accountability. Every small moment became a lesson, a shared smile with the child, a subtle nod of acknowledgement from Lara, a quiet pause in conversation. These were victories, incremental yet profound. Love, he understood, was not reclaimed by force. It was reclaimed by consistency, reliability, and respect. Every day he practiced presence, humility, and patience, and every day he glimpsed progress, however subtle, in Lara's slowly softening demeanor. The lessons were not easy. He faltered, hesitated, felt impatience rise. Yet each time he reminded himself, the journey was not about immediate results, nor about reclaiming power or affection. It was about becoming a man worthy of trust, a figure who could exist without dominance, and a presence capable of nurturing connection without coercion. Spain demanded nothing less, and slowly he met the challenge. Even the child's laughter became an anchor, a reminder that engagement required patience and attentiveness. Each game, each shared moment, each quiet acknowledgement of curiosity or fear offered a mirror of Lara's deliberate guidance. Markaram began to recognize that consistency, not command, created the bonds that would endure. He understood in the quiet Spanish air that control was irrelevant. Presence, patience, and genuine care mattered infinitely more. By the end of the week, Markaram felt a subtle shift within himself. He walked the streets with a new awareness, spoke with the child with gentle attentiveness, and observed Lara without expectation. Love had not returned fully, but trust had begun to weave itself subtly, silently, and inevitably. The transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. Spain had taught him to slow down, to exist without the machinery of control, and to understand that patience, respect, and effort were the foundations of connection. He was becoming better, not to win someone's love, but because anything less was no longer acceptable, not to himself, not to the child, and not to Lara. The lessons of Spain were clear. Life is measured not in power, but in presence, not in dominance, but in quiet, consistent attention, and not in conquest, but in respect, earned, slowly, honestly, and completely. The Spanish sunset draped the villa in hues of gold, amber, and rose, painting the walls and the cobblestone courtyard with colors that seemed almost alive. Markaram stood at the edge of the terrace, feeling the warmth of the fading sun against his skin, the soft whisper of the sea, carried by the evening breeze, and the quiet rhythm of life that had grown around him over these weeks. Everything felt slower, deliberate, intentional. A stark contrast to the whirlwind of power, violence, and unrelenting control that had defined his past. He watched the child running freely across the courtyard, small feet pounding against stone, laughter spilling into the air like a melody that refused to be contained. There was no fear in the child's movements, no hesitation, no sense of obligation, only freedom, trust, and curiosity. Markaram's chest tightened as he realized how different this was from the worlds he had known, where children were often tools, pawns, or shadows of ambition. This child existed untouched by expectation, nurtured not by fear or strategy, but by presence, patience, and care. Beside him, Lara's hand rested lightly on his arm. She did not lean on him, nor did she follow his lead. She stood beside him as an equal, confident in herself and in the life she had created. The contrast between her strength and the world he had once ruled was stark, humbling, and profoundly moving. She had survived everything. She had vanished when necessary, built a new life from nothing, raised a child in silence, and re-entered his orbit not as a surrendering figure, but as a fully realized woman who had learned that control over oneself was far more valuable than control over others. Markaram felt the weight of the past pressing briefly against him, memories of battles, betrayals, and calculated moves that once defined every moment of his existence. He had been a man who measured success in power, who equated love with authority, who believed dominance could secure devotion. And yet, looking at Lara, at the child, at the life they had quietly built together, he realized how small all that had seemed. Power without respect was empty. Authority without understanding was meaningless. Possession without trust was hollow. The air around him seemed charged with a new kind of energy, one not born of control, but of presence, patience, and transformation. He understood now that love did not demand sacrifice in the conventional sense, the way he had always imagined it. It did not require the surrender of self to another's will, nor the giving up of desire in exchange for affection. Love demanded change, yes, but not loss. Transformation was not a cost. It was a realization, an evolution of character, patience, and empathy. Markaram turned slightly to observe Lara. Her expression was calm, serene, yet touched with a depth of emotion that had never required dramatics to communicate. There was pride in her gaze, not pride in control or manipulation, but pride in achievement, resilience, and integrity. She had taught him, through absence and patience, through observation and quiet insistence, that true strength lay in mastering oneself, not others. She had survived everything: the chaos of his past, the unpredictability of his world, and the shadow of their shared history. And in doing so, she had become untouchable, whole, and radiant. He felt the child's small hand slip into his own. The contact was simple, unremarkable, yet profoundly grounding. The boy looked up at him with the same calm intelligence that had first unsettled him months ago on the plane. There was no demand, no expectation, only curiosity, trust, and gentle recognition. Markaram realized that this trust had not been given lightly. It had been earned through patience, consistency, and presence. And in that small hand, he felt the culmination of everything he had learned since arriving in Spain. Markaram exhaled slowly, feeling a release he had not known he needed. For years he had wielded power as though it were armor, a shield and a weapon all at once. Every decision had been calculated, every movement precise, every moment measured against consequence and control. And yet here, in the golden light of the Spanish sunset, he understood that none of that armor mattered anymore. Strength was not in control, it was in presence. Authority was not in command, it was in empathy. And love, real love, was not in possession. It was in consistent, deliberate care and understanding. He looked out over the horizon, where the sun kissed the waves in a seamless blaze of orange and pink. The beauty of the moment struck him with clarity. Life, like the waves, moved in cycles, carrying away past mistakes and failures, leaving only what could endure. Some forces could not be commanded, could not be conquered, and could not be owned. And some connections, the ones that mattered most, existed quietly, demanded attention through presence and patience, and were nurtured rather than coerced. Markaram felt Lara's presence beside him as an anchor, not a guide. He did not need to lead, did not need to assert, did not need to impress. He simply needed to exist as the man he was becoming, aware, present, patient, and transformed. Every moment spent observing, supporting, and engaging with her and the child reinforced this understanding. He was no longer the man who sought to dominate or possess. He was the man capable of sustaining trust, respect, and quiet affection without forcing it. The child paused briefly, looking up at him with a question that required neither an answer nor instruction. Markaram smiled gently, a response of acknowledgement, warmth, and consistency. In this simple exchange, he felt the depth of transformation within himself. Here. No threats, no power plays, no schemes, only connection, presence, and understanding. This was the strength he had never known he needed, the love he had never understood, and the life he had never truly envisioned until now. Lara's eyes met his for a fraction of a second, and in that glance, he read recognition, respect, and cautious trust. Nothing was rushed, nothing forced, nothing claimed prematurely. Love, he realized fully, did not return through conquest or effort alone. It returned through integrity, patience, and consistent demonstration of value. Every small gesture, every attentive act, every careful choice reinforced the delicate architecture of connection that had taken months to rebuild. Markaram's heart, which had once measured life in victories and power, now measured it in moments, attention, and shared presence. He had reclaimed meaning, not control. The lessons of Spain, the patience of Lara, and the trust of the child had taught him that life was not about dominion over others, but stewardship of oneself and respect for the lives around him. Power, he realized, could be seductive, but it could never substitute for understanding, love, or purpose. The sun continued its descent, and the golden light reflected off the villa's walls, warming the space around them. Markaram reached out, lightly resting his hand on Lara's, not claiming, not guiding, merely acknowledging and sharing presence. She responded with the faintest touch, a mirror of his own care, and the child ran ahead laughing, unaware of the depths of adult reflection, but perfectly attuned to the safety and warmth surrounding him. As the first stars began to appear in the evening sky, Markaram understood that the past, though present in memory, no longer dictated his actions, his feelings, or his priorities. Every decision, every reflection, every lesson had converged in this singular understanding. Love is earned through patience, presence, and respect, not claimed through power, possession, or control. The man he had been, the man of dominance, authority, and fear, had ended quietly, replaced by someone capable of truly experiencing connection. Markaram finally spoke softly, his voice more for himself than for anyone else. "I see it now," he murmured. "Not possession, not control, not dominance, transformation, patience, presence, earning trust, earning love." Lara did not reply immediately, simply offering a small nod, a smile, and the warmth of acknowledgement that spoke louder than words could. The child ran toward them again, small feet tapping on the cobblestones, carefree and joyous. Markaram bent slightly to catch the boy in his arms, holding him close without command, without assertion, simply presence and warmth. He felt the weight of responsibility, not as control, but as care, protection, and love, freely given and freely received. Lara joined them, slipping her hand into his as they watched the horizon together. The sky was a canvas of gold, orange, and violet, the waves below reflecting every nuance, and in that moment, everything aligned, past, present, and future. Markaram felt a quiet humility, a deep understanding that survival, love, and trust were built not on fear, manipulation, or power, but on patience, presence, and deliberate care. He let the breeze wash over him, the sound of the waves remind him of rhythm and inevitability, and he felt the shift within himself complete. Spain had taught him to slow down, to observe, to learn, to exist without domination, and the lessons had borne fruit. Love, real love, was not possession. It was something earned, slowly, patiently, and with deliberate attention. And now, for the first time, he felt he was worthy of it, and capable of giving it in equal measure. Markaram turned slightly, watching Lara and the child interact. Their laughter, their gentle movements, their shared quiet moments, each one reinforced the understanding that the past no longer held them captive. Flights, choices, sacrifices, disappearances, all had led to this singular moment of clarity. He had reclaimed meaning, not power, and in doing so discovered the enduring truth. Love that survives everything is not demanded. It is cultivated, earned, and cherished in silence, patience, and integrity. The sun finally disappeared below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in twilight. Markaram, Lara, and the child stood together, a small family not of circumstance, but of conscious choice, deliberate care, and earned connection. The past remained, but it no longer dictated the narrative. They had survived everything, endured every challenge, and emerged transformed. Spain had changed him. Lara had taught him. And in the quiet, golden aftermath, Markaram understood fully that love was no longer something to possess, but something to nurture, slowly, honestly, and completely. And that, dear viewers, is how love survives everything, through patience, trust, and transformation. Markaram, Lara, and the child remind us that true connection isn't about possession or power. It's about showing up, being present, and earning love every single day. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and let us know in the comments which moment moved you the most. Share it with someone who believes in the power of love that endures, and make sure to subscribe to Heart-Woven Tales so you never miss a journey of passion, suspense, and emotion. Thank you for staying with us till the very end, because every story deserves to be felt completely.